Welcome to the COVID-19 Safe School Operational Reentry Planning. My name is Ken Trump. I'm president of National School Safety and Security Services, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Along with my colleague, Chuck Hibbert, senior consultant to National School Safety and Security Services, who is with us from Cape Coral, Florida. Thank you for coming today, participating. We want to make this useful to you in a time that's very challenging. Our background, very briefly, is specific to 30 plus years each in pre-K through 12 school safety and security. It's important to understand that we are talking from a school safety, security, and emergency planning perspective today, particularly with the emergency planning emphasis. How do we plan, prepare, position ourselves for recovering from various types of contexts, from an active shooter type scenario to emergency planning for weather and natural disasters would be a typical lens, but we are looking today specifically at re-entry into schools by students and staff safely from an operational perspective. Our work has specifically been pre-K through 12. Consulting, training, professional development, tabletop exercises, and expert witness work from higher profile active shooter cases to other types of school crimes and violence. So we look at this differently. We are an educational support professional firm and experience working both in school districts and from a consulting perspective from all 50 states and internationally. We are independent and non-product affiliated. I'd like to take a very quick poll here to see if we could get a feel for the number of participants. I'm going to launch this. If we could take a few seconds, please check the box as to which represents your particular school or education setting. And give a couple more seconds. Okay, we'll share the results with you. Results are approximately 61% from public school setting, school districts, 19% rather from independent schools, and others from charter, parochial, educational associations, and other groups. Thank you. The academic challenges in a COVID-19 setting are real. This is not our area of expertise. And you'll find as we continue talking today, that's exactly why we're having this webinar. It's our first webinar of many, but we're really starting the conversation. One of the best quotes to capture the academic challenges that I saw yesterday that resonated with me as both a parent and a professional was from a Cleveland area school superintendent from about the 9th largest school system in our state, who said that they're planning for the fall. Discussions yesterday from our governor focused around possibly having blended learning where kids go to school 2 days a week and then are home for 2 or maybe other 3 days with online learning. And the superintendent captured that by saying, we're trying to move from a mode of assigning work to providing instruction. And I think that everyone is challenged today, from parents to our wonderful educators and administrators and support staff who've stepped up. And we recognize that. All of the valiant rapid responses by school staff from across the nation, from meals and assignment packets delivered to children and families by school transportation staff and educators, teachers who are providing student and family support hotlines, and with counselors and psychologists, the enormous effort with social emotional connections, from individualized virtual meetings and YouTube morning announcements to virtual spirit days and weeks and drive-by residential parades to bulletin board signs and motivating yard signs delivered to the front yards of homes by school staff, all the way to drive-in theater, virtual or car procession, track and field commencements. So we applaud our educators for stepping up, leaping up, and working to leap forward in these very challenging times that everyone pretty much agrees is not an ideal situation. While the conversation for school reentry, that little piece that has been going on so far as we strive to work day to day and maybe a little bit for tomorrow and the end of this week, has been on academics. Our conversation today is on operational and support services and the need to begin these conversations from departments such as, or functions such as facility, student health, child nutrition, transportation, safety and security, student support services, communications, human resources, financial, legal, construction and school planning, and others that are not directly in the academic side of the house or job roles, but are critical to have in place the very details that are needed so that we can start a smooth transition academically as well. The challenge that we all face today was best captured by one of my favorite quotes that I struggle to read because it's so complicated in knowns and unknowns, but I think it captures best the challenge that we face. Former Secretary of Defense who said this in a news conference that's lived on for about 20 years said, as we know, there are known knowns, there are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And if one looks throughout our history of our country and other free countries, it is that latter core category that tends to be the most difficult ones. So as we work to deal with the unknown unknowns, there is no textbook on school reentry or managing any of this, and we are flying the plane while we build it along the way. As far as leadership for reentry planning, what do we know and what do we don't know? Let's talk about some of the things that we know just to lay some context here. Schools across the nation were obviously closed. That's why we're here. And they will reopen at some point, varying state to state and school to school or school district to school district. There are multiple models and interpretations of the health risks. We don't know exactly which one to follow, but there are legitimate risks, as we certainly know from the losses that have occurred. Fear, especially related to the safety of children, though, is often even greater than the actual risk itself. And as we deal with the safety of our children, just as we encounter after high-profile school shootings and weather natural disasters, we are in a context where there is a great deal of fear, and there will be fear that we need to lay the groundwork to reduce when it comes to students and staff coming back into our schools. Well, we also know that the longer the crisis goes on, the more politics enters into decision-making, especially at the state and federal levels, and those things flow down to us in our private schools, our public schools, our educational support agencies. And the reality is the longer we move forward, the more political influences we may find impacting the decisions with reentry, how that's done, when that's done, and what that actually looks like. And so we are certainly going to have to take a look at leadership issues in highly ambiguous and certain contexts. But the key to successful student and staff reentry tomorrow is detailed operational planning today. And it needs to be a balance of academic planning and operational planning, not either or. For those who've worked and researched in polarity management, we know oftentimes there are very important issues. They get caught up in the debate of either or, the polarity piece, the extremes, and it becomes a win-lose, my way or your way. And we certainly can't do that. We have to take the best from academic planning and operational planning, minimize the downsides in both, and try to keep that balance in addressing this and making sure that the operational side of the house, which has historically been built upon and implemented upon supporting the delivery of academics is also having a strong voice at the table at our schools and school districts when it comes to moving forward. The goal for today is simply to get the conversation started in your schools and the operational and support planning that's needed to make sure that we are ready to roll on day one operationally. If we could take one quick poll here, and then there'll only be one final poll to go through. We would like to ask you to take a look. We got the first poll here. Let's see if we can go to poll number 2. On the impact of COVID-19 on your school or school districts. How has COVID-19 impacted you? And then a second question is, how is it going to impact your school budget as based on what you know now in the next year? We've launched that poll. If you could go through that, we'll give a few seconds here, maybe half a minute, and see what people have to say about the impact on your ability to educate and support students and the impact on your school budgets as you anticipate for the next year. Okay, we'll take about another 10 seconds and tally up the results. Okay, I'm sharing the results. There may be some overlap in your screens here, but about 42% said severely impacted the ability to educate and support students. 43% said moderately impact. And as far as budget cuts, 26% anticipate severe budget cuts, 43 moderate budget cuts, 13 minimal. About 7% of the respondents said no budget cuts, and very few expected any type of increase. And we'll put these results in our blog at schoolsecurity.org so that you have that available after the webinar. It's something that you can reference back in your school communities. Obviously, it's not a scientific research study, but it gives a feel that this is something that's severely or moderately impacted your school or school districts educationally, and we're going to look forward. We're not looking forward to it, but we're forward looking and anticipating budget cuts that we're going to have to try to recover under with even fewer resources. So let's briefly talk about leadership, communication, and relationships, and setting a framework for how we move forward in leading our schools and our different departments. And then we're going to move through the operational planning area. What we know, my doctoral program research at Johns Hopkins, I'm in the third year for my EDD and looking at school administrator communications with parents about school safety issues in highly ambiguous and uncertain contexts. And oftentimes that means after a high-profile school shooting, but we couldn't be in a more ambiguous and uncertain time than we are now. What does leadership look like, and what do we need to consider? Well, leadership in highly ambiguous and uncertain context means that people are dealing with too much change in too short of a period of time. And as leaders, whether that's a department leader of a particular department in a large school district, support services department, or whether that means as the head of a school in an independent school, a principal or superintendent, is that our leadership needs to be adaptive and flexible. We need to be aware of and responsive to equity issues, because those tend to be illuminated very much, as we know, academically, but also in other areas of support to children and families. From support service perspective, we need to make sure that our decisions are evidence-based and expert guided, not driven by political influence as much as we can minimize that and influence that. And most importantly, authentic and transparent. And with authentic and transparent comes communicating in times of high ambiguity and uncertainty. And one of the most important things we can do as leaders in the education community is what's known as meaning making, creating a compelling narrative to explain this context of ambiguity and uncertainty to our stakeholders, whether that's the employees who work with us in a facilities department that are custodial, maintenance, and support personnel, or whether those are our parents, students, academic staff, or other members of the broader school community. How do you view this? What lens are you looking for, and what's your framework for moving forward to your school community? And that involves telling what you know and what you don't know. A lot of times we're afraid to say what we don't know, and it's okay to say we don't know, but we also want to make sure that people who are listening hear from us as to where there are credible sources where other people can get information when they don't know something and you don't know it and don't want to give them bad information. We also want to be aware of multicultural and multilingual considerations. We're working with one large school district with more than 30,000 students in their school community at a very diverse population. And one of the things that we learned from their multilingual coordinator is that families out in the community who were non-English speaking were multiple steps behind others just in receiving basic information on social distancing, on school closures, and the overall context of being safe in a COVID-19 world, and had no idea some of the fundamentals that have been getting out to people in English languages, and those various communities can be lost if we're not aware of that in our communications, and making sure that we're focusing on equity in our communications and support for individuals who are not English speaking alone. And to communicate clearly, concisely, and regularly. If you have not started communicating with your school community now, please start tomorrow, because communications need to be, again, consistent and regular and updating. We see in many states, New York, Ohio, the governors hold regular press conferences daily at a specific point in time, just to give regular updates, to show a presence, to show that you're engaged, to communicate what you know, what you don't know, and the next steps. We would encourage you to do that from your schools and your school districts, not necessarily a daily press conference, but to make sure that you are visible and out there, even if you're working from home, and can get out a message a week just to give people updates. And it's also involved relationships in terms of leadership. Strong coordination is needed internally, within departments, across different departments and functions in schools, to make sure that they're coordinating and talking together and represented at the same table. We have worked with districts that are moving forward or attempting to, but people are frozen in times of high ambiguity and uncertainty. And a lot of times that internal coordination is not there. We've found some schools where, for example, the exceptional children director for services for children with special needs was not at the executive table in conversations about reentry, where support services such as facilities didn't have a strong voice or at least presence in the overall discussion, and services like transportation that will be critical. We also want to make sure that there's coordination with community partners, with non-traditional partners, that our input and feedback and engagement and participation is diverse and inclusive in getting multiple perspectives. And the common theme we hear across the board in our needs assessment is the importance of treating students, families, staff, and others, and ourselves with grace, dignity, and respect during these times. We had a couple of participant questions come in by email, and for those questions that you line up for us, we will make sure we respond to those with follow-ups and detailed resources in our blog after the webinar. Two of the questions we had was, number one, we have a daycare center in addition to preschool and pre-K classrooms on our K-12 campus. How are other schools planning to reopen facilities for smaller children who cannot wear masks, cannot maintain 6-foot physical distancing, and touch a lot of toys? Another question came in that we are a public school in New York. We're talking about a phased-in return starting with staff. Questions: gloves versus no gloves, masks only in common areas or hallways, temperature checking, are there sample reentry plans for schools, and what do we do if there's a positive case? There are many questions like this that remain unanswered at this point. The reality is at this time there are potential templates being developed to support reentry, but we are again building the plane as we're flying it. And this conversation today is to start these internal discussions. There is a document that is circulating out in cyberspace. It is the CDC draft interim school reopening guidance. If you go to our website, schoolsecurity.org, and click on the COVID-19 articles and resource page, I have posted this full document, and it includes the first 3 pages on child care programs, and the next 3 pages after that, interim guidance for schools and day camps. This is something that is in development. We don't know how that will change or how that will translate, but the 3 phases they discuss in this document are phase 1, where schools remain closed, phase 2, where they're reopening with enhanced social distancing, and phase 3, you reopen more with distancing measures intact. A lot of the conversation, as you'll see, focuses on recommendations for safety actions, including promoting healthy hygiene, intensifying cleaning, disinfection, and ventilation, circulation of clean air in your facilities, ensuring social distancing, limiting sharing of common items among kids during the course of the day, ranging from food services to, if you're in a child care center, different toys and items, and training your staff. The guides also discuss monitoring and preparing, being prepared to check for symptoms and signs, planning for when staff, a child, or a visitor becomes ill, having isolation areas, some things that we'll run through a little bit in more detail here in the webinar, and maintaining healthy operations. So these are some broad categories. I'm looking at the document now, and again, I posted that as a resource for you, saying that this is an unofficial document and could evolve, but it'll give you an idea of where CDC's recommendations are going, which I've noticed tends to filter down through the states and to local school districts and communities. And it's going to be very challenging. If you look at the safety actions recommended for healthy hygiene, it includes having adequate soap, hand sanitizer with at least 60% alcohol, tissues, and non-touched trash cans. The question that came up in one tabletop exercise we were facilitating with an operational team last week was, how are we going to get all these supplies? How are we going to keep that stock from a facilities perspective? How do we manage that where we already have been running hundreds of thousands of dollars in the red in those types of supplies in our schools, and now the demand is going to be greater. We had a primary school, grade level principal ask about having hand sanitizer in each classroom as an expectation from teachers. And we know that we can ask kids to bring that. Oftentimes teachers do that out of their own pocket. But how does a recommendation that's coming down to a school or school district get implemented? What are the resources for that, and what is that going to look like? How do we take our buildings, which may be challenged with some older facilities, and make sure that the ventilation systems and repairs have been done, if any, and that we have more open type of environments for fresh air? How do we do that and still not compromise our safety and security posture where we have reduced access in our schools and school facilities by not propping open doors? So there are going to be some conflicts in objectives here. There are going to be some polar opposites. And the question is going to come down as we read through all of these suggestions, should that be the guidance that becomes the final guidance, of what does this look like in reality? Who is going to be taking the temperature? Who's going to be dealing with these issues? So we'd like to step into several of these operational areas now, and just highlight some of the questions that need to be answered as we move forward. No one has all of the answers. The purpose today is to start feeding questions out to those of you to get the conversations going so that we can make sure we're asking the right questions. What we're finding now is that people are focusing on here and today. They're focusing on academics. They're focusing on a lot of other potential issues for reopening on the academic side, but we're not talking about these other issues. So I'm going to toss to Chuck now, whose expertise is in security and emergency preparedness issues for transportation, and ask him to walk through a couple of slides here with you on some of the considerations for school transportation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Ken. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you in these certainly unprecedented times. I've been monitoring the chat, as some of you know, and there are many great questions being posted. I hope we have the time to address most of those. I'm concerned, however, that we will not. So let me just take you just a few points here. I've picked the school bus just as an example, what I believe is issues that we are going to face just from the operational side. And so I want you to be aware of some of those. So Ken, if you would, the next slide. Is this how your school buses are going to look when you reconvene? And certainly we hope not. Frankly, if children do not ride the bus in similar numbers as we've had in the past, it's going to compound the problem you're going to be facing at the school in so many different ways. And I just want you to think about this as we focus on just really kind of one example on the operational side. So Ken, could you go to the next slide? The school bus is, for many of our students and parents, it is absolutely the first contact they have with the school. We've said this for many years in our transportation trainings, is the bus and the driver are the first point and the first images many of our parents have and our children with what school is going to be like. So we're going to be focusing on just a little bit on the school bus. Obviously you can read what was on the slide for yourself, so I won't be reading those to you, but I think it is important to ask the question, what will they see when the door opens? Are they going to see a driver sitting there with a mask on? In all likelihood, that is very well what they may see. And if so, what's going to be the impact on particularly the younger children, those who are not used to riding the bus, when they see that masked adult on the bus? I think it really is one of the reasons why we've been talking to our clients specifically about the fact that we're going to have to be we have to be ahead of this in regards to communications to our parents. And I know Ken's going to get into that in greater detail, but what are they going to see when that door opens, and what are they going to understand, and what are going to be the expectations? One of the other issues associated with this is, what issues do stakeholders have? Parents, grandparents, guardians, others who are concerned about the school and the safety of school children. Well, in my opinion, honestly, some of these issues are going to be unchanged. There really is only one primary issue that is always the focus of every stakeholder, and that is, will my child return to me safely at the end of the school day? And that's true whether we're talking about public schools or independent schools. If you're providing transportation, people care about one thing primarily, and that is, will my child come back safely? Now, with COVID-19, we've added some issues to that. We used to just focus on driving safely to and from home with the child on the bus. Now we certainly have added this additional health risk as well. So I think it's important that we not lose track of that issue. Will we get back safely? So while we're focusing on COVID-19, transportation still has the obligation in regards to keeping kids safe and the driver safely operating the bus. So just one quick sidebar here in regards to, if you're going to have your driver's mask, be sure the mask they wear that's being issued to them is one that does not affect their vision. I know that sounds pretty simplistic, but it is one of those things that we're hearing about on occasion. So some of the other issues that we're going to be specifically seeing here is the bus clean? Now, again, that's always been an issue, but it's never had more emphasis than it does now. And how will this message, again, be conveyed to stakeholders? Are we communicating? We're going to have to communicate, in my opinion, unlike anything we've done before, so that our parents, our stakeholders, our kids will be very comfortable getting back on the bus and coming into the school building. I want to talk about the fact that many schools are talking to us about social distancing on the school bus. And so that raises the issue just from a standpoint, and I'm going to belabor this point just a little bit for you, for your thought process today, as to how many children are going to be on the bus. Ken, could we have the next slide? So let's just talk about, just for a couple minutes here, how many students are on the bus. Of course, you know, this is going to vary on the type of bus, but a full-size one, are you using a minibus? Are you using a van? What is the transportation mode going to be for getting those children to you, whether you're an independent school or a public school or a charter? These kinds of things are applied to you. But we're going to talk a little bit. Let me give you a specific, just for the point of discussion today. Let's use a full-size school bus, which in today's school buses manufacturing, a standard bus can hold up to 81 to even 90 passengers with 24 seats. Now, again, from a practical standpoint, those of us who've been involved in transportation know that in the past, we put a lot more elementary kids in the seat than we do high school kids. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. So also, just from a standpoint of, again, remember, there are 24 seats on a bus, and those seats are 16 inches apart. So if we use social distancing, if we use 6 feet between students, that gives us 6 students on each side of this 81 passenger bus. So let me repeat that. I want you to think about it, because this is the stumbling block that we often get into with conversations with our clients, is 6 on each side of the bus. So our bus that we may be talking about 12 students on the bus. Okay, someone raised the point that, well, we may be able to get siblings to share a seat, but we're going to get 12 or so children on a bus that, just for the sake of discussion, let's just say that our 81 or 90 passenger bus, just for today's conversation, let's just say that there are only 60 students on that bus. A route that normally has 60 students on it, now we have 12. So just for conversation, it will take, I think my slide says 3 times. That was a very conservative estimate on my part. Obviously, if you do the math, 12 and 60, we're talking about 5 times the amount of time it may take to run just one route. Let me just say that again. It could take up to 5 times the amount of time to run what was one route. Now, granted, in route planning and so forth, if we know we're only going to have 12 children on the bus, then we'll adjust the routes accordingly. So yes, the routes will be shorter in time, but it's still, think about this. We've got to get 60 students to school, and yet we can only put 12 at a time on a bus. So how long will that take? Obviously, that answer is going to be varying from school to school, to route, etc. So what we're trying to do is just to focus on some of these issues just with transportation, And another question I have is, as we were discussing with our school clients, are you going to sanitize the bus between runs? If so, how long will that take? And what equipment will be necessary for the driver between runs to sanitize the bus? And how much will it cost? How much will it cost? For those of you who strictly are on the academic side of the house, if you will, can you see the impact that this will have on instructional time? As a principal, what do you tell teachers who may very well have students coming into their classroom on a staggered basis? I mean, obviously, they're not all going to arrive at school at the same time. As we were talking a few weeks ago, before the schools closed, this was already an issue in some school districts with buses being delayed. Now we're adding this impact on it. You can see how much greater it will have on instructional time. So do you allow students to stagger in and start your school day as you have planned? Or do you wait to start the instructional day until all students are present? If so, what does that do? First of all, what does that do to your instructional amount of time you have for instruction? And secondly, what do you do with those kids who are on, again, using my example of 3 or 5 runs? What do you do with those kids who are already at school waiting for all of their other classmates to arrive? And the opposite of that is dismissal. Just going to be just reversed. So if we have again, using my example, if we have 3 or 5 runs that have to be completed to get one route, as we've used in the past, what are we going to do with those kids after school? We're going to have to deal with those children. They're going to have to be supervised. Now, some will say, well, we'll just put them, as someone mentioned, we'll just put them into our after-school program. Okay, that may very well work, but what is your after-school program in a position to accept the number of students that will now be coming into their area of responsibility? So we just want to make sure that as we talk about this, that we don't overlook. I heard a superintendent interviewed yesterday on one of the major news networks, and he was saying that, we're going through issues, transportation, kids getting on the bus, they've got that figured out. I was somewhat skeptical because I don't know that anyone who has the answer. If you're going to do social distancing, let me emphasize that again. If you're going to do social distancing on the school bus, what options do you have? So I just wanted to share with you just that point about the bus, and we haven't even talked about taking their temperature or any other issues associated with the bus because of our time constraints. I just wanted to share with you that. Keep that point in mind as you go forward. Ken, thanks.
Thanks, Chuck. And I tried to catch up with some people in the chat section now. This is our first webinar. We've had a great response. We appreciate that. And we are working through. If you have questions, tech issues, or anything, please turn to the chat to put them there to help us with improvement. And also, you can always email, and we'll give that information along the way. We do have a ton of information. Again, keep in mind now we're going to work through in the next 5 to 10 minutes some of the various operational departments and issues to consider. You will be able to get this webinar. It's recorded and will be along with the slides that you're seeing embedded within the webinar. It'll be posted on our website at schoolsecurity.org. We had several questions about that, and we will be following up on various questions and issues in our blog to help keep the conversation going. To get this conversation moving forward, we're here today because we are not seeing the conversations occurring at a significant level, if at all. And we have been engaged in working with districts that we were contracted with prior to COVID-19 closures and transition things like our tabletop exercises online. And what we're hearing back from the school building and the district levels is those conversations need to begin now. It's not something we can wait while people take a little respite over the summer, which is well deserved, and then come back the week before. So if we could continue walking through just some of the different operational departments. All of this supports academics, but think about the impact here on facilities department. Is your facilities department leadership represented at the table now in cabinets and leadership meetings and planning? Oftentimes, those support service departments are not at the same organizational structural level to have a voice in some of the task forces, committees, or cabinet levels groups that are talking about reentry at the highest level. But look at the importance of the discussions. As you turn to those CDC interim guidance pages, they're going to be shocking. They were to me, working about 35 years in schools, to say, how is this going to be done? Chuck asked that question in all of our consultations, where people say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we have this in our emergency plan. Our question is always, how's that going to be done? And the CDC guidelines, for example, talks about deep cleaning and disinfectants and hand sanitizers with at least 60% alcohol, supply chain issues. Someone brought it up in our chat group here today, and we ran into this conversation and working with the district last week, where they talked about this all sounds good in CDC recommendations. However, the supplies aren't there. When we talked with the technology and planning person who had the same problems, quite frankly, that I did when looking at upgrading webcams for even faster and higher tech screening, you can't find them. They're not available. Things are sold out. So how are we going to put hand sanitizers in room, even if we have the budget? What's our supply chain? And has our purchasing department been engaged in this process? Our business office, are they at the table purchasing? People who are the ones who are going to be going out for bids, going out for emergency purchases, are they at the conversational level in these discussions? And oftentimes they're not. And that's what we're working with, trying to help fill those gaps. What's the budget, especially with looming cuts? While certainly it's anecdotal, we're hearing common numbers within the 20 to 30% range of budget cuts at state levels. And we know that the state funding is going to impact many local schools. We know that if for private schools, there are tuition issues that are going to have to be addressed since we've transitioned to homeschool crisis online learning. How is that going to affect registrations next year and tuitions? And if you had a planned tuition raise, as I know several cases, I've talked with heads of school this week, how does that come across now when that planned tuition raise of 3% or 4% that your board decided maybe 6 months ago, how's that going to impact families today that are unemployed, and how's that going to affect your enrollment and then any additional tuition changes that need to be occurred? When we talk about facilities, vendor delivery management tracking, who's going to track who's coming into the docks, to your warehouses, to your school districts with these changes? What requirements are going to be in place there? Are they going to need to have masks? How are you going to store supplies? How is that going to be handled? How do we log in our vendors, which many schools don't do, when these deliveries come, so that, heaven forbid, if we need to go back and track who was there in any contact tracing, we can do that. If we look at health service issues, and I'm going to talk about a number of different contexts, including front office staff and other considerations as we move through these slides. Let's take a look at health services now. Do you have a school nurse or health services staff, a health aide? If not, who's assuming that role? And oftentimes we know that goes to the office support staff, your school secretary in the front office. So how is that engagement going to occur? Are we going to have personal protection equipment, PPE for health services staff, our nurses, our health aides, or the school secretary who may have to handle a student who comes to the office with real or psychosomatic types of health issues? We need to make sure that if taking temperatures is recommended, who's going to do that, and where do you get the thermometers to do that? And if you find someone who you believe shows the symptoms and needs to be sent home, where are you going to house those children? And what do you do if you have on the first days or week of school or two, children coming in groups of 20 or 30, 50 kids with psychosomatic episodes based perhaps on anxiety that's led up to them coming to school? And how do we track and report illnesses, large mass illnesses, and absences to our local health departments? So these are things where there may be some answers to this. There should be some answers, but these are conversations that need to be held. Again, our goal today is to get these points in there, and these are just touching the surface of the things that we're having conversations with schools and facilitating the planning. Remember, people, those of us who are present today may be engaged and forward thinking, but many of our colleagues, those who we lead and supervise, may still be frozen, may have had personal impact, may be health impact, it may have family impacts, may just be shell-shocked by this and are not processing the level of details that we need to get to. If you do have questions, just because of logistics here, if you would put any questions in the chat section, we'll make sure that we try to address that now or afterwards. Nutrition services is another operational department that needs to be at the table. Our food services staff who are going to see children in the school cafeteria for breakfast and at lunch times. Questions that we're going to ask: how do children eat? Where do they eat? There are recommendations in the CDC guidelines about having individual meals, items that are not shared, limiting contact of items. How does that look like? What does that look like in your food lines? Is this something that's part of your strategic planning for nutrition services department? When do they eat? There are many discussions about students in the classroom eating in classrooms and not the cafeteria. Okay, that's possibly great, but what are the implications for your teachers? Who's supervising those children? When are they going to eat? When is their break time? How does that impact contractual issues that you may have with your unions and professional associations? How are you going to design or redesign your food services area? How are your food services staff who are working at the checkout cashiers who are interacting with kids? Are we going to put up plexiglass like we see in some of the warehouses and food service or food stores chains today? And where is all this food store? Who's supervising all of this? Again, nutrition services, people that we need to make sure are at the table. We'll take a moment and look at safety, security, school policing, and emergency preparedness issues. If you have school resource officers staffing your schools, what may the impact be of COVID-19? We've had a number of cases where some school resource officers, as well as dozens of teachers and administrators and other educational support staff members who have been severely ill and died from COVID-19. When budget cuts hit your sheriff's department or local police department, are officers going to be redeployed? Are some going to self-reassign? In other words, not want to be in a school with hundreds or thousands of children, but out on the road at a lower risk where they may have a half a dozen public encounters during the day? And what does your memorandum of understanding say about the services that you should expect with that agreement? And will that MOU need to be altered? Will there be conditions outside of your school or school district that will affect off-duty police? We worked with a district 2 weeks ago that are heavily relied upon not only SROs, but off-duty officers in their district of more than 33,000 students. And those officers now are working out in the community in different types of housing developments and shopping centers and other places, and may not be available in that pool to work for the schools anymore. How deep is your bench in your safety and security leadership? If your executive department, leadership department in a larger to mid-sized district has an executive director of safety and security, what if she or he becomes ill and incapacitated, or the 2 or 3 people in that department fall ill and are unable or have family emergencies and are not there? What's the leadership succession, continuity of operations, not only there, but also all the way up to you who are here today, and those within your respective departments, from the head of schools and superintendents to the building level principals and administrators? What happens if those people become incapacitated? How deep is your bench, and do you have a formal chain of command established? Visitor management issues. One of the recommendations in the CDC guidelines is essential visitors. Who is an essential visitor? What does an essential visitor mean? How are we defining that? Are we going to tell parents some are or not essential visitors? And then how are we going to manage visitor containment and exposure to other individuals? Are we going to restrict the area that we for visitors? How far are we going to allow parents? How do we engage with parent associations and organizations who are active volunteers in our building and trusted and loved visitors? What type of protection do we have for our receptionists and front office staff who are monitoring all of this incoming traffic? And how do we deal with the hardware, the physical security aspect, the equipment, the different touch points, different type of cleaning? We've been in schools just prior to COVID-19 closures where we used the various visitor management check-in devices, some that are using swiping driver's license, others where the visitor signs in using a mouse and a computer screen or a touch screen. Who's going to clean that? How often is that going to be managed? Who's going to do that, and with what equipment? Who breaks up fights if they occur in our schools, and how are we going to do that? And will there be a hesitancy of staff now to get physically engaged in those types of incidents that may occur? And how does COVID-19 reentry affect emergency preparedness drills, fire drills? Are we going to walk in lines with 6 feet of distancing? Are we going to do lockdowns now where there's a conflict, where we have hard corner orders where kids all gather up in a lockdown for an active shooter in a corner? And how's that conflict with social distancing requirements and the other types of drills? So that's just an example, again, of our conversations with safety and security and school policing personnel. And then there's student services, our psychologists, counselors, mental health, behavioral supports personnel who are so treasured and trusted, and so few to deal with the social emotional needs on student return, not just of students, but staff. It's going to be a very emotional return, and particularly children with special needs. Chuck and I are both touched by how COVID-19 closures are creating so many additional gaps and hardships for children with special needs. And how is this going to occur? How are we going to unfold in schools where kids come in running and hugging the first day, where we're talking social distancing? And then who's going to care for those caregivers? Again, to look at some other departments, we've got about 6 minutes here. Just real quickly, an overview to get thinking going. Human resources, we often don't have them at a planning table for many types of task forces and groups. We tend to go to them afterwards, but how they need to be engaged to look at sudden vacancies and filling substitute positions. What happens if the first week of school you have teachers and support staff who stay home out of fear and anxiety of what might occur? Do you have substitutes that are already hard to find? Same for transportation, for bus drivers. And do you have that lined up? Is your HR department prepared to do that? And if you have extra staffing needs, even if temporary, how are we funding this and facilitating all that employment background check and other things that will have to be expedited? Do we have an infrastructure in place? And how do things that come about as requirements of COVID-19 reentry conflict contractually with our teachers' unions, our support staff unions and groups? Financial services, again, also has to be at the table in terms of how do you ramp up for extra cost? How do we determine what are essentials and people, products, and services? And how do we track? Is there a structure in place for tracking COVID-19 specific additional costs in case there are opportunities for reimbursements and grants from state and federal funding sources? And then how do we prepare for that massive trickle down of budget cuts? And if this is not enough, look at the various unique contexts that we also need to consider. Before and after school programs, community programs that work at community-based organizations in our school, daycare, child care centers, athletics, sports, swimming pools, and more, performing arts and other extracurriculars, drop-off and pickup lines. And we have a November election today, and even in those, this year rather, and even in those schools where you have accommodations in place for professional days off and no school, you're still having people who come in and use the school as a polling place. How does that affect cleaning and social distancing? It'll be in place. And all of this, as some of you have referred to in the chat section, leads to a lot of legal questions. Chuck and I do expert witness work. We're not attorneys, but we certainly see that there are going to be legal issues arising. We're already hearing of that on the academic side with some gaps in services for children with special needs. While educators of source are doing their best, we know litigation is going to come there. What are we questions to ask internally with your legal counsel? What are we required to do by law? What is the federal and state guidance, and what does the word guidance mean? And what is that a requirement, a mandate, and what happens if we don't follow it? What if we do implement some of these guidance recommendations and that opens up greater liability risk, unintended consequences? And can we develop a strategic plan? And what is that line that would pass the bar of a test of reasonableness if we're ever challenged? And then, of course, how do we have a budget to pay for the legal services as well? So it's first steps. We encourage you to create a framework and strategic plan for reentry. Give the operational and support staff strong voices and weight at the table. Define who's leading the reentry planning, and not just an individual or small group, but what other key internal and external stakeholders need to be engaged. Remember that, as we've done today, the brainstorming the right questions, even though you won't have all of the answers or the perfect answers, is the first step. And status quo and staying static is not something that we need to do now. And the people who are engaged need to be doers, not just thinkers. We need people to get the task done, and we need to learn from others and not work in social isolation. How do you eat an elephant, as they say? In small bites, in small chunks, and that's the same here. Pull all of your departments, individuals responsible for these tasks together, start the conversation, and have each work in their respective work groups to develop a strategic plan that's filtered through, that's brainstormed, that gets feedback, that's reviewed and engaged with your school attorney. And then our communications staff, our school community relations, public information, public relations department has a huge role here that we'll address potentially in a separate seminar or webinar rather. And all of this needs to be put together in strategic communications plans with videos, social media, to get expectations set out with students, parents, stakeholders, and other stakeholders. And if you are not talking, start now. At least be visible with your community. We are working with schools. It's information on our website. We're going to have one more poll to find out what you want for next webinar. So if you bear with us for a moment, please, as we wrap up in the last 2 minutes. Online student reentry, facilitated tabletop action planning is something we've transitioned, like everyone else, our services online, and we're going to stay online afterwards. There's some things we can do here to save costs. Cabinet leadership briefings, and an upcoming web store with new digital resources. Plus our website has access to our blog. Please sign up for notices on the blog, e-newsletter, and keep in touch for webinars. I'll put something in the next webinar we're doing on social emotional with Dr. Scott Poland on Tuesday, May 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you will, if we could do one quick poll for evaluation, we would greatly appreciate that, and feedback on what you want for the next webinar. So we're launching this poll. This poll has 2 questions. The first, if you could take a moment and as we wrap up and pick any topics that you would like to consider for future webinars, so we can prioritize that and get the resources, and then give us your evaluation as to the helpfulness in starting this conversation. We appreciate you taking a few minutes to do that. Respect for your time, we're at the 2 o'clock mark. We'll give you time to complete that, and certainly those who are welcome to exit out after that. And then also, while that poll's going, reach out to us with our contact information on the screen. We're going to leave the poll open for a few minutes. Appreciate those who have to move forward. Please stay safe, stay healthy, the best to you and your families and your colleagues. This is our first venture. We're welcome to feedback, positive and constructive, on how to improve. But we appreciate the opportunity and your interest. Chuck, did you have any closing comments while we're doing the poll?
I just want to say thanks to everyone. Your time, we know, is very valuable, and we appreciate you being with us today, and we look forward to being with you again.
And we thank the number of our clients who are with us today that we've worked with over the years, and it's good to see the many of you that have signed up and are continuing the great things that you've done in your school. And for everyone else, please do reach out. We'll get this posted within, my goal is 1 business day on the website, schoolsecurity.org. We're also building that plane as we fly it as well, with all of the new digital resources we're creating. So for those who need to sign off, again, thank you, and we'll leave the poll open here because we really want to get that feedback. I'll leave it, and it looks like everyone voted 100%. We're going to now end this webinar, and we thank you very much. Stay safe.